As of the end of July 2026, 3,610 people have been killed in the Mexican state of Sinaloa, and 4,172 more have simply disappeared. No bodies, no arrests, no answers. All of it traced back to a single plane ride that lasted less than 3 hours. Schools in the state capital shut their doors with no warning. Business leaders estimate the region has bled 15,000 jobs and more than $1 billion. 14,000 Mexican soldiers have been poured into one state, and the killing still hasn't stopped. In July of this year alone, Sinaloa averaged 4.4 violent deaths every single day. And here's the part that makes this almost hard to process. For nearly 3 decades, the organization at the center of all this was run by 2 men. Joaquin Guzman Loera, known as El Chapo, and Ismael Zambada Garca, known as El Mayo. One of them was the face, the escape artist, the tunnel builder, the man who broke out of maximum security twice and became a household name on 3 continents. The other was the ghost. El Mayo went more than 40 years at the top of the global drug trade without spending a single night in a Mexican prison cell. Between the 2 of them, they built what U.S. intelligence agencies now describe as one of the most powerful trafficking organizations on Earth, moving cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and eventually fentanyl into every major American city. Today, both of those men are sitting in American prisons serving life sentences. El Mayo was sentenced on the 20th of July, 2026, and ordered to forfeit $15 billion. And the empire they built didn't get inherited. It didn't get passed down. It got ripped into 4 separate pieces that are currently trying to kill each other. 4 factions: Los Chapitos, Los Mayos, a group under El Chapo's own brother, and a 4th run by a man in the north who most people outside Mexico have never heard of, and who, as you'll find out, may be quietly winning all of this without firing most of the shots. But I assure you, the real story here isn't the body count the news reports. The real story is in the internal arrangement that held this thing together for 44 years. The specific rule that was broken to detonate it, and the reason the man who is technically winning the war is not the man who is actually walking away with the business. Those are the details the coverage conveniently skips over, because they don't fit in a headline. Because amidst all of this, the drones, the armored trucks, the 14,000 soldiers, one man collapsed the largest criminal federation in the Western Hemisphere with just one move. One decision, made on a single morning in July of 2024, that changed the map of organized crime in North America forever. He didn't need an army. He needed a lie, a meeting, and a plane. But before we get into that, I need you to first understand how this thing was actually built. Because if you don't understand the structure, the collapse just looks like random violence. It isn't. Every single thing that happened after 2024 was written into the design in the 1970s. Act 1. The foundation. Let's start with something most people get wrong immediately. Sinaloa did not become a drug state because a cartel showed up. It's the reverse. Sinaloa was a hub for cannabis and opium poppy cultivation long before anybody used the word cartel in Mexico. The geography does it. You've got the Sierra Madre Occidental running down the spine of the state, remote highland valleys, terrible roads, almost no state presence, and a Pacific coastline with ports. If you were going to design a place to grow and ship narcotics, you'd design Sinaloa. So what actually happened in the 1960s and 70s was that farming families who were already growing product in those mountains started moving up the chain. They stopped selling to middlemen and became the middlemen. These weren't corporations. These weren't syndicates with org charts. These were families, cousins, in-laws, godfathers, neighbors from the same 3 or 4 highland towns. Hold on to that detail, 'cause it matters at every single stage of this story, including the part happening right now. One of the first men to move serious volume was Pedro Aviles Prez. Aviles is the pivot point for everything that follows, and he's barely a footnote in most retellings. He was among the first to industrialize the trade, moving marijuana north in real quantity, using aircraft, running a network rather than a route. And at some point, Aviles brought in a young kid who happened to be friends with his son. That kid's name was Joaquin Guzum Loera. Aviles was killed in a shootout with police in 1978. Now, while all this was going on, the market was changing underneath everybody's feet. The Colombians had cocaine, and cocaine was worth vastly more per kilo than anything growing in the Sierra. The Sinaloan families diversified, they stopped being producers, and started being logistics. Anybody in Colombia or Central America who needed product moved across a 2,000-mile border, went through them. And to run that, they moved operations to Guadalajara. This is the first consolidation, and it ran from roughly the late 1970s to 1985. The leadership was Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and above them, Miguel Angel Flix Gallardo. Their bridge to the Medellin cartel was a Honduran trafficker named Juan Ram Mata Ballesteros, who split his time in Colombia and acted as the intermediary between the two worlds. What Mata established in those years is a trafficking pattern that is still in use today. Cocaine moving by air and sea into Central America and Mexico, then overland into the United States. 40 years later, that's still the route. But here's where things get interesting, and here's where you need to pay close attention. Flix Gallardo's real contribution wasn't trafficking. He wasn't the best smuggler. His contribution was organization, and it's the single most consequential idea in the history of Mexican organized crime. He divided Mexico into administrative territories. He called them plazas. And he assigned each plaza to a lieutenant who ran it like a franchise. That lieutenant handled his own security, his own logistics, his own bribery of local police and local officials, and in exchange for the right to operate, he paid a percentage upward to the central leadership in Guadalajara. Think about what that solves. If you're running a criminal organization the size of a country, your biggest threat isn't the police. It's your own people fighting each other over territory. The plaza system minimized internal friction by making the boundaries explicit and the incentives shared. And at the same time, it let the Federation present exactly one face to the Colombians and exactly one face to the Mexican government. One negotiating partner, one point of contact, one set of bribes. That is the high watermark. That right there in the early 1980s is the closest Mexican organized crime has ever come to being a single unified thing. Everything after that point is fragmentation. Every single thing. And the fragmentation started with one murder. In 1985, the Guadalajara traffickers kidnapped, tortured, and killed Enrique Camarena, an undercover agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. And whatever calculation they made before doing it, it was catastrophically wrong. The United States applied pressure on Mexico at a level that had never been applied before, and the political protection that had shielded these men for a decade evaporated. Fonseca and Caro Quintero were arrested. The leadership scattered. Flix Gallardo still had enough juice to stay free for a few more years, keeping his head down, but he was finally arrested in April of 1989. And when the center collapsed, the plazas didn't dissolve. They went independent. The Arellano Flix brothers took Tijuana. The Carrillo Fuentes family took Ciudad Juarez. And El Chapo Guzum, along with his partner Hector Luis Palma Salazar, held Sinaloa. Now there's a version of this story you've probably heard. the meeting in Acapulco, where Flix Gallardo supposedly summoned all his lieutenants and personally divided Mexico among them to prevent a war after his arrest. It's a great scene. Netflix treats it as fact. Treat it as contested. Flix Gallardo himself has told reporters he had nothing to do with it. And more to the point, whether or not that meeting happened, it failed. Completely. What had been the Guadalajara cartel devolved into the Tijuana and Juarez cartels, and those two groups became mortal enemies through the entire 1990s, despite the fact that everyone involved had come up together. The Sinaloa Cartel, as a name and as an entity, traces back to exactly this moment. It was not founded. It congealed. A loose association of Sinaloa-rooted groups that El Mayo, El Chapo, and a handful of partners gradually consolidated under their control. And they built fast. The Sinaloa group allied with the Valencia family in Michoacan, who ran the Milenio Cartel, and that alliance gave them two things they did not have: Pacific ports outside their own state, and access to Chinese precursor chemicals. That's the doorway into methamphetamine. That single alliance is why the Sinaloa Cartel became a synthetics organization decades before anyone was talking about fentanyl. But the wars started almost immediately, and they were ugly. In November of 1992, Guzman sent roughly 40 gunmen into a Tijuana cartel party in Puerto Vallarta. 9 people died. The Tijuana cartel tried to return the favor at the Guadalajara airport in May of 1993, and instead of killing Guzman, they killed a Mexican cardinal. Guzman ran for Guatemala and was arrested 2 weeks later. His partner Palma was arrested in 1995. Now listen closely, 'cause what happens next sets up everything. With El Chapo in prison, the organization did not stop. It was run by his brother Arturo Guzman Loera and by 3 brothers named Beltran Leiva, Hector, Alfredo, and Arturo. And El Chapo maintained partial control from inside his cell by passing instructions out through his lawyers. In 2001, ahead of an extradition order to the United States, he escaped. And within a short period, he had taken full command back. And then, in 2008, came the first great betrayal, and it is the template for absolutely everything that happens 16 years later. The alliance between Guzman and the Beltran Leiva brothers broke down after the brothers came to believe that El Chapo had personally handed Alfredo over to the authorities, sold him, traded a partner to the state for his own advantage. The Beltran Leivas retaliated by assassinating El Chapo's son, Edgar, and the war that followed tore across Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango and displaced hundreds of families. Look at the shape of that accusation, because it's going to come back. Not the drugs, not the money. The specific charge that one partner sold another partner to law enforcement. That is the one thing the Federation could never absorb. That period left 3 men standing as the visible heads of the organization: El Chapo, El Mayo, and Juanjos Esparragosa Moreno, known as El Azul. And then, over 6 years, all 3 were removed. In early 2010, Mexican forces killed Ignacio Coronel, known as Nacho Coronel, and severed the link to the Milenio Cartel in Michoacan. That rupture, combined with further fractures inside Milenio itself, eventually produced the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which today is one of Sinaloa's 2 main rivals, and which is going to show up again in this story in a way nobody predicted. Guzman was arrested again in February of 2014, leaving El Azul and El Mayo running things. El Azul reportedly died of a heart attack in June of that year, though rumors that he's alive have never fully gone away. Guzman escaped again in July of 2015 through a mile-long tunnel dug directly into the shower floor of his cell. His third and final capture came on the 8th of January 2016, and his extradition to the United States in 2017 set off an internal struggle for control that has never actually ended. That's the real origin of the split, not 2024. 2017, everything since then is aftershock, because the first attempt to seize the vacuum came almost immediately, and it failed. El Chapo's top lieutenant, Damaso Lopez tried to take the organization from El Chapo's sons, and the violence that followed was severe. Between January of 2016 and May of 2017, Sinaloa recorded 1,797 homicides. The sons crushed the uprising. Lopez was arrested and extradited to the United States in July of 2018. And that fight, winning that fight, is what turned Los Chapitos from a nickname into a faction. Before that, they were El Chapo's kids. After that, they were a power in their own right, and everybody in Sinaloa knew it. Act 2. The Cold War and the Collapso. Here's where we are entering 2017. El Chapo is gone. His sons have proven they can fight. And El Mayo, 70 years old, the last man standing from the original consolidation, is still there. And for 7 years, two things happened at the same time, running in parallel. Both of them mattered. Most coverage only ever mentions one. The first thing is that Los Chapitos built a machine. Starting around 2017, El Chapo's sons acquired what amounts to a monopoly on drug retail and fentanyl production inside Sinaloa. And then, they did something the old generation never did. They went local. Extortion, control of water distribution, the illicit tobacco and e-cigarette trade in Culiacan, gambling dens. This is a critical shift, because the old federation made its money outside the state and kept the home territory relatively calm. The Chapitos started taxing the state itself, and they wired the city. I mean that literally. When federal forces finally moved into Culiacan, they took down more than 430 clandestine closed-circuit television cameras that Los Chapitos had mounted on public streetlights, watching parks, busy intersections, highways, jails, and military bases. On top of that, hundreds of local police officers were on their payroll. If you want to know how deep that control ran, you already know the answer, because you've probably seen the footage. On the 17th of October 2019, federal forces captured Ovidio Guz M. Lopez in Culiacan. Los Chapitos' response was to besiege the entire city, blockading access roads, orchestrating a mass prison break, and kidnapping soldiers and their families. The government caved. President López Obrador personally ordered Ovidio released. 14 deaths were officially reported. A forensic source later told researchers that the morgue received as many as 70 bodies. That's the machine. That's what Los Chapitos had built. But here's the second thing that was happening at the same time, and it's the one that actually decided this war. The trust between the two halves of the organization was dissolving. Tensions between the leaderships peaked after members of El Mayo's own family gave crucial testimony against El Chapo at his trial in the United States in 2019. Understand what that meant to the Guzim side? The Zambaras put El Chapo in prison for life. From where the sons were standing, that wasn't cooperation with the justice system. That was a hit carried out in a courtroom. Then in May of 2020, a man named Jose Rodrigo Archiga Gamboa, known as El Chino Antrax, the former head of El Mayo's enforcement wing, was found dead after fleeing probation supervision in San Diego. Los Chapitos are widely believed responsible. That June, a firefight between the two sides outside Culiacan ran for hours and left 16 dead. So why didn't the war start in 2020, you ask? Well, It all comes down to one man's judgment. El Mayo pushed restraint. Consistently, he reassigned senior operatives to other regions specifically to avoid destabilizing the core territory and drawing federal attention. Low-level clashes between his allied groups and Chapito's elements kept flaring in the highlands, but they stayed sporadic, and they stayed contained. That's the thing about El Mayo that almost never gets said. He wasn't restrained 'cause he was gentle. He was restrained 'cause he'd watched Tijuana and Juarez destroy themselves in the 1990s, and he understood something the younger generation didn't. Violence is a cost, not a product. Every gunfight in Culiacan was a bill somebody had to pay. And in that period, from roughly 2017 to 2024, the organization was not two factions. This is where nearly everyone gets it wrong. There were four, Los Chapitos and Los Mayos, in overall command, yes, but alongside them sat a group run by El Chapo's own brother, Aureliano Guzman Loera, known as El Guano. And in the north, the remnants of the old Beltran Leyva organization, now under a man named Fausto Isidro Meza Flores, El Chapo Isidro. 4 blocks, coexisting, held in place by one 70-something-year-old man's ability to keep everyone's ambitions in check. And beneath those 4, researchers have counted at least 20 smaller armed cells operating in shifting alliances: Los Ninis, Los Rusos, Los Salazar, Los Cabrera Sarabia, Grupo Flecha, and on and on. That's not a cartel. That's a coalition. And coalitions need a chairman, which brings us to the 25th of July, 2024. A plane touched down at Doa Ana County International Jetport in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. About 10 kilometers from the U.S. border, El Mayo Zambada was on board. Sitting next to him was Joaquin Guzman Elpez, one of El Chapo's sons. U.S. law enforcement agents were already waiting on the tarmac. According to Zambada's own account, which has been largely confirmed by U.S. court records and by Guzman Lopez's own plea agreement filed on the 1st of December 2025, here is what happened. Guzman Lopez lured him to a meeting. He subdued him, he sedated him, and he flew him north across the border and handed him to federal agents. Why? To secure a more lenient sentence for himself. After more than 40 years of evading every agency on 2 continents, El Mayo Zambada was taken out by a man he'd known since the man was a child, in exchange for a plea deal. That is the one move. That is the single decision I told you about at the start. No army, no siege. One meeting and one flight, and the largest criminal federation in the Western Hemisphere was structurally dead. And notice what it was. It's the 2008 accusation made real. The exact charge that broke the Beltran Leyva alliance, one partner selling another to the state. Except this time, it wasn't a suspicion. It was documented in a federal plea agreement. But here's the part that might actually surprise you. The war didn't start. Not for 6 weeks. What reporting at the time described was a tense, brittle calm across Sinaloa while both sides did math. Because a war is expensive, and neither side was certain it would win one. Los Mayos had lost their leader and their center of gravity. Los Chapitos had gained an enormous strategic advantage and an enormous liability at the same time. They had just done the one thing that made them illegitimate in the eyes of every allied family in the state. So for 6 weeks, both sides recruited. And according to testimony given by El Mayo's former security chief, Los Mayos learned that even Archibaldo Guzem was buying weapons in bulk and recruiting more than 2,000 men for an offensive. That intelligence is what ended the calm. Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, El Mayo's son, known as Mayito Flaco, started recruiting in response. And this is the moment the war was actually decided. Before a single coordinated shot was fired, cuz look at who came to him. the armed wings under El Chapo Isidro, the Cabrera Sarabia family, and El Guano, El Chapo's own brother, who switched sides and joined the Zambatas against his own nephews. Think about that for 1 second. El Chapo's brother chose the Zambatas over El Chapo's sons. That is how badly the sons had damaged themselves with that plane. In the early hours of the 9th of September 2024, Maito Flaco authorized coordinated operations against Los Chapitos, with a senior field commander known as El Comanche issuing orders for synchronized strikes across the state. At dawn, a Mexican army convoy ran into armed men in La Campia, a Chapito stronghold on the eastern side of Culiacan. A sergeant was killed in the firefight. Clashes spread through the surrounding neighborhoods and out into the Costa Rica area within hours. The decisive escalation came when Flecha-aligned forces pushed into southern Sinaloa and directly challenged Chapito's territory. From there, El Mayo's followers began revenge operations in the town's ringing Culiacan, killing and disappearing men accused of Chapito's association, and then moved north toward the capital itself. The federation that Miguel Angel Flix Gallardo designed in 1980 for the specific purpose of preventing internal friction between plaza bosses had taken 44 years to completely come apart. And I want to give you a number that shows you how fast it happened. In August of 2024, Sinaloa recorded 44 homicides. In September of 2024, the month the war began, it recorded 142. Now, we know Mexico has seen cartel violence before. We know about Tamaulipas under the Zetas. We know about Michoacan. But this, nah. Now this was different in its character, and the people who live there will tell you so directly. A forensic official in the state put it plainly: Sinaloa had never been a place like this before. Here's why. When two factions of the same organization fight, they don't fight over territory the way rivals do. They fight over loyalty. And loyalty is a thing you can only test by asking about a person's cousin, their neighbor, their old boss. Which means the violence turns inward, into families and neighborhoods, in a way that a turf war between strangers never does. The brutality escalated for 3 specific reasons, and they compound. First, both factions were consciously trying to inflict maximum cruelty for revenge. Bodies dismembered, skinned, wrapped in plastic, dumped on streets or hung from highway overpasses next to banners. The two sides even developed signatures. The Chapitos left baseball caps on their victims, mocking El Mayo's habit of always wearing one. Maito Flaco's people left pizza boxes. Second, and this is the one nobody talks about enough, the need for fresh bodies pushed both sides to recruit young, undertrained gunmen who had fewer hesitations about what they were doing. Adolescents and young adults now represent roughly 40% of homicide victims in the state and about half of the missing persons. Search collectives have documented recruitment of children between 13 and 17. Criminal recruiters have been documented working private drug rehabilitation centers, offering drugs as payment to bring young men into the ranks. Third, both sides deliberately adopted tactics from other criminal groups, specifically because those tactics projected strength and built a reputation. They copied the worst of what Mexico had already produced. And then there's the technology, which has genuinely changed what a cartel war looks like. Small arms are still used in 9 out of every 10 homicides in the state, but both factions field homemade armored vehicles built in clandestine workshops. And above all, it's drones that have reshaped this fight. Both sides took agricultural drones, the kind used for crop spraying, and rigged them to carry mortar rounds. At least 31 drone strikes were recorded in the state between September 2024 and November 2025, including strikes on government facilities. Armed drones have been blamed for contributing to Sinaloa's worst wildfire season in a decade. Since September of 2025 alone, the government has seized close to 6,000 improvised explosive devices and 330 hand grenades. A woman displaced from a small town north of Culiacan described the arrival of Los Mayos simply: they came dropping bombs from drones and pushed Los Chapitos out. To put into context just how comprehensively this broke the state, Sinaloa recorded 478 homicides in the year 2022. That was the lowest figure since 2006, the year Mexico's drug war formally began. In 2025, the first full year of this conflict, the state recorded roughly 1,657, a 67% jump over the year before. Sinaloa is now one of only 6 Mexican states where the homicide rate has gone up under President Sheinbaum, at a time when the national figure actually fell 22%. A state forensic expert reported that between September 2024 and July 2025, the number of bodies arriving with gunshot wounds increased fourfold. The number of women killed in Sinaloa, whether caught in the crossfire or targeted directly, hit a record in 2025 with 100 cases. And the disappearances are, in some ways, the worst number, 'cause there's no ending to them. Official federal data recorded roughly 2,600 homicide victims in Sinaloa between September 2024 and March 2026, and separately, 185 alleged cartel members killed by government forces in the same window. But Noroeste, the newspaper of record in the state, has kept its own daily tally, cross-referencing official data against cases its own newsroom confirmed. Their count runs about 420 higher than the government's for the same period. Their reporting alleges the state prosecutor's office quietly suppresses the figure by filing killings under cause of death pending classification. As of the 29th of July 2026, Noroeste's running total stands at 3,610 violent deaths and 4,172 disappearances since the 9th of September 2024. One search collective in Culiacan, Sabuesos Guerreros, estimates the true number of disappearances since July 2024 is closer to 5,800, and they'll tell you that's likely an undercount. If you do the math on the official figure alone, that's more than one person killed every 4 hours for nearly 2 straight years in a single Mexican state. And the collateral damage runs past the body count. Business leaders in the region estimate 15,000 jobs lost and over $1 billion gone. Real estate prices in Culiacan's wealthy neighborhoods crashed. A Spanish newspaper ran a headline that translates roughly to "the narcos aren't buying houses in Culiacan anymore." A restaurant owner explained it bluntly: because of the war, not even the traffickers are spending money in the city, and the economic spillover just stopped. Mazatlán, the tourist city on the coast, saw visitor numbers drop by as much as 30%, with dozens of high-end coastal developments left half-built after investors walked away. Between September 2024 and October 2025, Mazatlán alone recorded 553 kidnapping cases, an 83% increase over the same period the year before. Even the institutions are draining out. Between September 2024 and July of this year, the Culiacan City Council approved 157 requests from municipal officers to retire or take early retirement, 105 of them early. The first approval came through on the 10th of September, 2024, one day after the war started. By mid-2026, only about 30 new recruits had finished training and made it onto patrol. But ironically, the thing everybody assumed would break, the actual drug business, barely flinched. Act 3. Who is actually winning? So, let's answer the question in the title. And let's answer it honestly, because the honest answer has 4 parts. According to the International Crisis Group's July 2026 report, plus reporting from Milenio, Noroeste, Insight Crime, and U.S. and Mexican officials, the picture on the ground is this. Los Mayos are winning the war. Not narrowly. Decisively, multiple sources report that Los Mayos have largely taken Culiacan from Los Chapitos, dominating the southern and eastern sections of the city that were the crown jewel of the Guzum operation. They've seized Villa Jerez, a farming area 45 minutes from the capital that's become a hub for street-level trade and extortion. They attacked and took Jess Mara, the rural district north of Culiacan, where Ovidio Guzum was arrested in 2023. They pushed into Concordia in the south, dislodging the local Chapitos strongman and sending hundreds of families fleeing. By late 2025, sources close to the conflict were telling Milenio that La Maíza controlled as much as 90% of the territory Los Chapitos once held. Few areas have reported anything like a return to normal, though some have. A leader representing displaced families in Concordia said something striking. With Los Chapitos gone, things are calmer. Dozens of families have gone back. But Los Mayos now control much of local life there, including public transport. And a man who drove residents in and out of town was disappeared in December of 2025. That's what winning looks like. It's not peace, it's a change of management. Los Chapitos are losing, but they are not finished. They still hold Mazatlán, which matters enormously, because that's one of the ports through which precursor chemicals from China and elsewhere enter the country. Federal officials suspect Chapitos cells were behind the abduction of 10 mining workers in early 2026, at least 7 of whom were murdered. Their 2 remaining leaders, Ivan Archibaldo Guzum Salazar and Jess Alfredo Guzum Salazar, are still fugitives, with the U.S. government offering rewards in the millions for information leading to their capture. And here's the move nobody saw coming. Under pressure from Los Mayos, Los Chapitos reportedly struck an arrangement with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the organization that grew out of the wreckage of their own father's Michoacan alliance, and one of Sinaloa's 2 great historical enemies. Mexico's government initially denied any such alliance existed. By June of 2026, it had backtracked and acknowledged that Jalisco's leadership had supplied Los Chapitos with fighters and with money. Sources describe it as a limited arrangement rather than a full pact, and the quality reflects that. A former Sinaloa state prosecutor described what Jalisco was sending north in a single word that translates roughly as garbage. Young, under-trained recruits pulled from Jalisco's national recruitment network, shipped into a war they were never prepared for. When you have to hire your father's enemies to fight your father's partners, you are not winning. El Guano's faction chose correctly and survives. El Chapo's brother threw in with the Zambatas early and remains one of the 4 blocks, folded into the winning coalition. And then there's the 4th answer, the one that actually matters. El Chapo Isidro is winning the peace, which in this business is worth more than winning the war. Sinaloa's entire northern region has largely escaped the violence that has consumed the rest of the state. The north accounts for only a fraction of the state's homicides. And that's not an accident. Fausto Isidro Mesa Flores, running an amalgamation of the old Beltran Leyva organization and local criminal families, now dominates Guasave, Sinaloa de Leyva, Ahome, and El Fuerte. A Sinaloa government official put it in the simplest possible terms. El Chapo Isidro is the one and only factor keeping the North peaceful. And while the 2 famous factions have spent 2 years killing each other in Culiacan, His organization has been quietly overseeing a network of fentanyl production sites and trafficking routes and shipping product north without interruption. 1.5 tons of fentanyl seized in the town of Ahome in December of 2024 has been linked to his group. Here's something almost nobody actually talks about. The remnant of the Beltran Leyva organization, the faction that lost the 2008 war, that got hunted nearly to extinction by El Chapo and the Mexican state, is now arguably in the healthiest position of any group in Sinaloa. Intact leadership, quiet territory, functioning production, no war. They lost in 2008 by fighting. They're winning in 2026 by not. But even if Los Mayos hold the map and El Chapo Isidro holds the north, it's worth asking the question the whole thing was supposedly about. Did any of this, the war, the 14,000 soldiers, the 2 arrests, the life sentences, actually disrupt the drug trade? Well, no. And the evidence on that is uncomfortably clear. Under pressure from Washington, Mexico deployed thousands of troops into Sinaloa, destroyed dozens of synthetic drug laboratories, rounded up nearly 2,500 suspects, seized more than 68 tons of drugs, and transferred close to 100 alleged and convicted traffickers into U.S. custody. Manual cargo inspections at the Pacific port of Manzanillo went from 4% of incoming containers to 10%, with the increase focused on shipments from China. And yet, fentanyl users interviewed in Tijuana reported no change in price after the cartel's rupture. A small quantity still going for around 50 pesos, less than $3, no reported change in price or availability along the border or across it near San Diego. U.S. Officials have said directly that the infighting has not affected availability or pricing in major American cities, and that they believe most Mexican production still originates in Sinaloa. Why? Because fentanyl broke the old logic of drug enforcement. Marijuana needs land. Heroin needs poppy fields and a harvest season. Fentanyl needs a small quantity of precursor chemicals, a compact makeshift lab, a few people, and less than a day. Some setups documented by reporters are literally kitchen pots. You can't bomb a supply chain that fits in a garage, so when one faction's production goes offline, another's picks it up. Possibly El Chapo Isidro's. Possibly labs in the state of Mexico, hundreds of miles away. A harm reduction worker in Tijuana summarized the whole thing in a sentence: the drug will always flow, regardless of which group is behind it. The only real dent in fentanyl's potency and purity that the DEA has reported may not even trace to Mexico. Researchers have suggested it originated earlier, with a Chinese crackdown on precursor chemical suppliers. Which brings us to the piece of this that will determine what happens next, and it isn't military. In April of 2026, the U.S. government indicted 10 politicians and security officials in Sinaloa, including the sitting state governor, the mayor of Culiacan, and a sitting senator, alleging they carried out the cartel's business in exchange for monthly payments. The Mexican president has said the evidence is insufficient to justify arrests and extraditions. Mayors from 18 of Sinaloa's 20 municipalities signed a letter backing the governor. This is the actual argument. Not troops, not kingpins. Because the historical record here is unambiguous, Genaro Garca Luna, Mexico's Secretary of Public Security from 2006 to 2012, the man who ran the country's war on drugs, was convicted in a U.S. court in 2024 for taking millions in bribes from the Sinaloa Cartel across a decade. The Federation Flix Gallardo designed did not survive for 44 years because it was good at shooting people. It survived because the plaza system was built to purchase officials, and it never stopped purchasing them. The only question left to answer right now is whether removing leaders actually accomplishes anything, and Sinaloa is the cleanest test case anyone has ever had. Both founders are in American prisons for life. El Chapo since 2019. El Mayo since the 20th of July 2026, with $15 billion forfeited. Ovidio Guzman pleaded guilty in July of 2025 and forfeited $80 million. Joaquin Guzman signed his plea agreement in December of 2025. Four of the most significant traffickers in the hemisphere neutralized, and the result is more violence, more disappearances, more child recruitment, and exactly the same amount of fentanyl at exactly the same price. Other governments across Latin America are watching this and drawing conclusions, and some of them are the wrong conclusions. The kingpin strategy produces spectacular arrests, and spectacular arrests produce political capital. But even if another country wanted to run this playbook, the conditions in Sinaloa aren't exportable. A state with a 50-year cultivation tradition, a coastline with major ports, mountain terrain no army can hold, deep family networks that reconstitute after every decapitation, and an American firearms market supplying the guns. Take out a leader in that environment, and you don't get a vacuum, you get an auction. And here's the reality check nobody puts in the headline. Even if Los Mayos finish consolidating, even if Maito Flaco formally takes command of a reconfigured organization, which is exactly what multiple sources expect, the thing he'd inherit isn't the thing El Mayo had. His father sat at the head of a federation that could speak with one voice to the Colombians and one voice to the government. What's left is 4 blocks, 20+ armed cells, a rival cartel now operating inside the state, a wrecked local economy, a population that no longer supports it, and a generation of teenage gunmen who've learned that loyalty gets you handed to the dia. That last part might be the most permanent damage. As one former local prosecutor described it, the figure of the boss doesn't exist anymore. The man who covered funeral costs, who paid for defense attorneys, who made sure widows could put food on the table. That's gone. She described what's left as a deep sense of orphanhood. Another former prosecutor said the popular belief used to be that the cartel cared about the people of Sinaloa, and that today people are realizing it simply isn't true anymore. That's the thing the war actually destroyed, not the trafficking. The trafficking is fine. It killed the story the organization told about itself, the one that made recruitment easy and cooperation cheap and silence automatic. And you don't get that back with a victory. So who's winning? On paper, Los Mayos. In practice, El Chapo Isidro. On the balance sheet, the fentanyl business, which never missed a shipment. And in the courtroom, the U.S. Department of Justice, which now has El Chapo, El Mayo, and 2 Guzman sons in custody and $15 billion forfeited. Everyone else in this story lost, including, and this is the part that should stay with you, the roughly 3,600 people who are dead, the 4,000 who are missing, and the mothers in Culiac still walking fields near the airport with sticks, turning over dirt, looking for their sons. Joaquin Guzman bought himself a lighter sentence. He paid for it with a state. And the 4-way war he started isn't over. Not close. The 2 Chapitos brothers are still out there. The Jalisco Cartel is now inside Sinaloa and shows no interest in leaving. The North is quiet only for as long as one man decides it should be. El Mayo's gone for good, but his story, and the war he never wanted, isn't done being written.